It is my pleasure to introduce our presenter, Dr. Scott Nissen. Dr. Nissen received his PhD from Montana State University in 1986 and began his academic career at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. In 1995, he accepted a position at Colorado State University, where he's a professor of weed science in the agricultural biology department, working in both crop and non-crop integrated weed management. Dr. Nissen has an extension research teaching appointment and conducts laboratory, greenhouse, and field research on a variety of topics, including corn, non-crop, riparian, and aquatic weed management. Over his career at CSU, he has advised over 30 graduate students and has been active in participating in CWMA and affiliated groups for over 25 years. Welcome to the program, Scott. Thank you very much for being here.
Thanks, Montana, for the introduction. Am I ready to share my screen here?
Yes, you are.
Okay. And let me go to full screen. Okay. Thanks everybody for attending. I actually don't know what kind of attendance we have, so I'll just assume we have great attendance, as we always did in the past when things were a little more normal. I was asked to speak today about organic wheat or organic herbicides and talk a little bit about what they are and how useful they are. And I think it's a great topic because we're often asked, why do we use these horrible synthetic chemicals when we could do all these things organically? And I think the thing we have to let people know is that organic is not necessarily better, and that there are trade-offs and concerns regardless of the type of weed control program you're using. Let's see if I can switch here. Okay, just general ideas about weed management. I mean, most of you who are at the spring training certainly have a basic understanding of general weed management, things like prevention, mechanical control, biological, and of course, chemical. For most of you, chemical weed control becomes very important because it is, for most cases, the most cost-effective and beneficial management strategy, especially for controlling weeds in areas that have relatively low value. If you're growing expensive crops like strawberries or something like that, and then you can definitely afford the labor that would be required to do mechanical weed control on a large scale. But in areas where the land value is maybe just open space for public use or something like that, or roadsides, then you really need to think about going with the strategy that's the most cost effective. Obviously, prevention is by far the least expensive method, and some of you have probably seen presentations where the presenter shows a slide of what happens when a weed, an exotic weed, is first introduced, and the ability or cost of controlling it is very low initially. When you can eradicate it, small patches here and there, and then the cost of control increases exponentially as the number of acres are impacted. So most of you have seen those kind of diagrams, but prevention is by far the least expensive, and it is the basis of our early detection rapid response programs. The one run by the Department of Ag is a very active program, does a great job. It's definitely critical if you're trying to get away without using synthetic herbicides. For example, in many cases, people are bringing in weeds unknowingly when they're bringing in mulches and raw manure. Straw is a good example. Years ago, I tried to start a lawn from seed, and I thought I was being smart. Went out and got a couple bales of straw. Wasn't really paying attention to what it was, but thought it would hold the moisture really well. And a lot of green stuff started coming up that was a grass. I was pretty excited until I realized most of it was downy brome. So what I had done was brought in downy brome seed with my winter wheat mulch or straw. And so being very conscious about what you're bringing into a site is really important. Really important. Preventing weed buildups and purposely planting things. There are lots of other ways to reduce weed pressure. I was asked by one of my students recently to help him with a little project on puncture vine. And there were some really interesting little YouTube videos of a guy who had gotten a garden roller, attached some old carpet padding to it with duct tape, and put it behind his UTV and drove around his yard picking up goat head seeds. And I mean, that's a great strategy if you're trying to reduce in a non-chemical way. You're taking an annual plant and removing its main source of reinvasion, which is seed. And this, I thought, was a very unique way of taking a non-chemical approach. Obviously, he had a small lot, maybe an acre and a half, and he could he could have his kids run around on the UTV and give them something to do to pick up goat head seeds.
Dr. Nissen?
Yes.
I'm sorry, this is Monica from CWMA. It looks as though you need to screen share the presentation itself because we're still seeing the intro slide. So if you can expand that to presentation mode.
I went to presentation mode on my computer. Is it clicking at all?
It's still showing the slides as they are kind of, it's not full screen presentation.
Oh, well, let's try again.
There you go. Oops, what you did was working. Try that again.
Okay, let me hit. Is that still not showing the? Because I went to screen show. Let me turn off my video maybe.
So on the bottom right-hand corner of the file itself, there should be a little icon that looks like a screen itself. If you click on that, it should go full
I
screen.
know what that is, and I clicked
Okay.
on it.
You might want to stop the share and then reshare.
Okay. Let's see.
The red button.
Now go ahead and reshare the presentation. And then do you have dual monitors or one monitor?
I usually just have one. I do mirroring when I'm. Is that any better?
That looks good. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Let's see. Where was I? Okay. Are we good now?
We are good. Thank you very much.
Okay. Oh, I was just telling a little story about the guy with the UTV pulling used carpet behind it. There are actually national standards set for organic weed control and organic products. Most of the time, if a company wants to get a product labeled or used or approved for organic uses, they have to abide by the national organic standards. And it's really about producing and adhering to excuse me, a national organic program standard. Okay, so there are things that are labeled. And while, you know, most people who buy organic think that there are no other substances used, the National Organic Program does allow for things that are approved for control through, assuming that things are going to be done physically, mechanically, or biologically, that there is this list of approved products that can be used. So things like we'll talk about as the slides go by, that things that are approved for use on this organic list. And the organization that approves these organic products is called the Organic Materials Review Institute. The state of Colorado also recognizes a program at Washington State, which does the same thing. But the state of Colorado recognizes both groups, in approving products for organic production or processing or handling. These are all voluntary products or programs, and quite often if you do a Google search looking for an organic product, what you will find is that most of them list whether or not they're approved by this group, the Organic Materials Review Institute, because it gives them some extra credibility in how the product was produced. Okay. Now, you can't have a talk like this without talking about some of the advantages and disadvantages of organic products, or organic herbicides. Most often we consider them to be very rapidly broken down in the environment after application. And generally they have no residual control. Now that if you considered salt or sodium chloride or mag chloride, for example, to be fall into this category, you just need to drive Pena Boulevard into DIA, and you'll see the roadsides in many cases are bare ground. That's from the use of mag chloride on the roadsides that runs off onto those shoulders and works as an excellent bare ground product. So it's not always the case that there is no residual activity, but most of the things that we're going to talk about in the coming slides really don't have any residual activity. We think of them as being fairly low mammalian toxicity, but again, that's not always the case. And I'll give one example where the concentration of the active ingredient is high enough to have impacts on birds, and birds are actually listed on the label to be very careful about using them around birds. So what are the disadvantages? Well, probably the biggest one is how expensive these products can be when you start using them or think about using them on a large scale basis. Most of them are designed to be used by homeowners, very small acreage, very limited garden use, that sort of thing, and not considered to be used on large acreages. So the problem is they provide no residual control, and that's probably one of the biggest advantages of using synthetic herbicides, is many of them will provide a season's worth of weed control on certain weed species. And that's a huge advantage when you can't be revisiting a site every week or every 2 weeks because you don't have any residual control. Since a lot of these products are fermented or come from a process of fermentation, there can be quality differences from batch to batch. We had a grad student a few years ago who was working on an organic product, and the problem he had with his research is he could never get consistent results because each batch was slightly different. And so it makes it pretty difficult to do greenhouse or field work when you don't get the same quality in each batch of product you get. We also think there's a gross misconception that these products are not dangerous, and that people think, well, if it's organic, then it must be safe, and maybe I don't need to read the label and follow the label directions for protective equipment. It's also important to think about what's going to appear on the label that most of us would be reading. For synthetic herbicides, the kinds of things that we're most used to, most of those will fall into the caution range. So the lowest signal word on the list is caution, and that applies to probably 85% of all the synthetic herbicides that many of you would be using. The next level up from that is called warning, which there are some concerns about lung and skin irritation. After that, you get the two highest levels, which are danger and danger poison. The danger level refers to something that might cause permanent eye, skin, or lung damage. And there are very few synthetic pesticides or synthetic herbicides that fall under that category. There are a few. The main one being paraquat that might be used as a burn down on rare occasions. But that is, most of the synthetic herbicides that we use are going to fall into the caution and warning statement. The reason I threw this up here is because there are some very common and I guess fairly well marketed organic herbicides that fall into that danger signal word. So even though you're applying an organic pesticide or organic herbicide, if you're doing it for hire, you're still required to have an applicator's license, and you must adhere to all the PPE and worker protection safety standards that apply. Okay, the first one that I want to talk about specifically, that's all just kind of introduction about what's going on here, is that probably one that most homeowners and organic gardeners are familiar with is this corn gluten meal product, which is actually a byproduct of producing cornstarch and corn syrup. It's actually a much better fertilizer than it is herbicide. It contains about 60% protein, 10% nitrogen. The minimum use rate is 20 pounds per 1,000 square feet. So now if you were to use something like that on an acre basis, you would be using something around 900 pounds per acre. So you can see from this, it's not something you would use on a large scale. You probably couldn't afford it either. I didn't price it out here, but it is fairly expensive. The only work I've seen on it that was fairly definitive was from Iowa State University, where they found that they got fairly good crabgrass control, but the rate was 1.3 pounds per square yard. Of course, I'm converting between grams per hectare to pounds per square yard. So fairly high use rate. And years ago, there were a couple of departments of transportation that tried to use corn gluten in areas where people had concerns about using synthetic herbicides. And what they found was, because this has kind of a sweet consistency to it, that it was attracting animals like deer to the roadside, which is never a good thing, which is probably one of the main things that most departments of transportation would like to avoid. Anything that attracts a large animal to the roadside is not a good thing. So that was one of the main drawbacks. It does seem to work, and it is, as far as I've been able to tell, one of the only organic herbicides that actually has pre-emergence activity for annual grasses and a few broadleaf weeds, but mainly used for crabgrass control. So it's listed as EPA as a minimum risk product and is exempt from EPA registration. It is registered in Colorado, and all these organic herbicides have to be registered with the Colorado Department of Agriculture. It's what's called a Section 25B. So what happens, what are the downsides with this particular product? Mainly it has to do with, there are certain people who could be hypersensitive to things containing corn, and corn gluten meal can cause some irritation to people who are sensitive to it, especially when you're spreading it out as a powder over large areas. There's definitely the potential to come in contact with quite a bit of dust. Okay, other active ingredients generally involve products that include vinegar, clove oil, cinnamon bark oil, a whole variety of these sort of things. And those are the main things that people will buy, thinking that they're getting a product that is safer to use. The problem is some of these may be fairly non-toxic to humans, but also may lack efficacy and require multiple applications. So if we look at a few of these things, here's just one. If you go online and search a few of these out, this contains cinnamon bark oil at about roughly 1%. This particular product is not registered in the state of Colorado, probably because they didn't want to pay the registration fee. It's not terribly expensive, but the state does require that people who are selling products and making herbicidal claims do need to have the product registered in the state. Here's an interesting one. Moss melt. Moss are plants, obviously. We don't think of those as the kind of things that we need to control very often, but This one was interesting because it contains a product called limonene. And limonene is really just the oil that is squeezed out of the skins of lemons and limes and other citrus fruit during the juicing process. So you remove the juice, you've got all this, the rind of that particular fruit, and it contains, how many have ever taken an orange or lemon peel and bent it, and you can see a bunch of stuff spurting out. Those are all the oils that are contained in the rind of those particular fruits. And this general category is termed limonene. And limonene has been very useful for a lot of different things because it can substitute for the organic solvents that are used in many formulations of, say, herbicides that are not very water soluble, so need to be dissolved in something that's a little bit more lipophilic. So limonene has been used to replace volatile organic compounds in many formulations. You can buy versions of it for use around in aquatic or near aquatic environments if you're looking for a surfactant that needs to have be approved for aquatic uses. Most often those include some version of limonene. So this, again, the signal word of this is caution. It is labeled in the state of Colorado, and it is one of these 24B products. Okay, here's one that I did really want to spend a little time on, because this is one of those products that people may think is safe because it's considered organic, but it contains, this is called Green Gobbler. It is registered in the state. It is not a 25B product. This one actually requires EPA registration, although it is, again, approved for organic uses through this Organic Materials Registration Institute. Now, why is this one of concern, or why do I want to point it out specifically, is because if you look at the signal word is danger. Even though this is a product, a natural product produced from corn, or it is 20% acetic acid, and at that level, it can cause permanent eye damage, and that can be a significant issue. So when using something like this, I just pulled up a few words off of the label, and it indicates that you need to be wearing goggles, a face shield. You need and some respirator, long sleeve shirt, long pants, gloves. And this is the product that actually has a warning label about using it around any birds that may come in contact with the drift, because they would be highly sensitive to this product. So even though this one is considered organic and it probably is used quite frequently, it does require a lot of personal protective equipment and is quite dangerous if you're not careful. So you can imagine getting concentrated acid in your eye. This is one of those products that can cause permanent eye damage. Okay, there's a lot of other little products out there. If you do a Google search because you're interested in these kinds of things, here's another one called Weed Zapp, which is basically cinnamon oil, but it also includes other ingredients like a certain amount of acetic acid or vinegar, which probably adds to its activity. Most of these are non-selective, and that's the problem. They're non-selective, so you have to either use them very selectively or only use them before your plants of interest come out of the ground. They will cause injury to your crop, so you have to be very careful. They're only active on small weeds, like small broadleaf weeds, probably much better than small grasses. And the small grasses are likely to be much more or much less susceptible because they don't have apical meristems, right? They have what's called an intercalary meristem, which is below ground. So if you control the top growth, you still may, you're going to have a lot of plants coming back. This was the problem with paraquat before glyphosate came along, is that you had to keep making applications because grasses would keep emerging and surviving because of their intercalary meristems. Here's another one, which includes clove oil. wintergreen, lecithin, which is more of a surfactant. But anyway, when you're out there using these products, they do smell pretty good. For example, limonene, which I talked about before, actually is quite a pleasant smell. And you'd have the same thing with these particular products, where you'd have wintergreen and clove oil, which would be also very, not unpleasant to smell. Here we've got another one which includes quite a high concentration of clove oil. This one is currently not registered in Colorado, but all these products have the same sort of drawback, which is they don't have any systemic activity. They don't have any residual soil activity, so they're only really going to give short-term burn down control. And here's one that is registered in Colorado. It's again a combination of clove oil. Sodium lauryl sulfate is really just soap. And if you look at any commercial shampoo product or anything like that, you're likely to see sodium lauryl sulfate listed on the ingredient list, because it is a very good soap or surfactant, which could help to make the clove oil work better. But this product also includes acetic acid and citric acid. And if you look at the dilutions that are required to control weeds and the cost of $37 a gallon, and you're having to mix it 2-to-1 with water or 3-to-1, you can see that it's pretty costly product unless you're treating very, very small areas.
Hey, Scott, we're running out of time here.
This is my last slide. So just to reiterate some of the things talked about, organic herbicides are non-selective. Contact activity only. You have to be really careful about the concentration of acetic acid in some of these products, and don't work very well on perennials. Okay.
Thank you, Scott. That will bring us to the end of our time here. I didn't see any questions in there. We